Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to cover both the hazards and environmental effects in the new Dungeon Master's Guide for 2024. There are some new features for it. Some of them are just the repeated features from 2014, consolidated into one section. But we're going to take a look at each one, talk a little bit about it. But before we get to that, if you are a new or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you see, please consider hitting that subscribe button either now or at some point during this video. It helps me out quite a bit. We're going to talk about hazards and environmental effects. So let's go ahead and get started and see what we're working with. So first of all, what's changed in the Dungeon Master's Guide? Like I mentioned, the hazards and environmental effects, they've been sort of consolidated into one singular location. A lot of them were strewn about, even if they were in the same chapter. Some of them were hidden in random tables. Some of them were in different sections about different things. Hazards now have suggested level ranges at which they would be considered either deadly and or a nuisance. And we'll take a look at what that means in a second. And there are also just a few new or possibly new-ish hazards that were added. I tried to do some research to make sure that I wasn't wrong on calling them new. But again, the way that the new Dungeon Master's Guide is very consolidated, I did a search on D&D Beyond. I wasn't able to find duplicates of these other effects in other places, but it doesn't mean that they didn't exist maybe like on a DM screen somewhere and then they put it in the new Dungeon Master's Guide or something along those lines where maybe they're hidden somewhere else where I couldn't find them, or they're just actually very new. So let's go ahead and get started with the hazards. So the first one is brown mold, and I think this might be the most well-known hazard. And we can see immediately here that there's a nuisance level and a deadly level. So this would be considered deadly for characters at 5th through 10th level, and it would just be considered a nuisance to characters who are levels 11 through 16, or presumably higher as well. So it's just a 10-foot square patch of a brown sort of carpet-like substance. It causes the area within 30 feet of it to be considered frigid, and you might consider combining this with the either frigid water or extreme cold environmental effects that we'll look at later. Entering a space within 5 feet of it for the first time or starting your turn there causes the creature to take 4d10 cold damage or half on a save. I think one of the reasons that this might be so famous or infamous is that it sort of catches new characters or new players especially kind of off guard, because the way that you'd think to get rid of mold is to burn it, and brown mold specifically is not only immune to fire damage, but even when you bring heat anywhere near it, it will cause it to spread and grow a new 10-foot square patch towards that source of heat. But of course, notably, if you do want to get rid of it, cold damage will destroy it instantly. Moving on to fireball fungus. This is one of the ones that the game developers kind of touted in a lot of their early interviews. So we can see that this one is considered deadly at levels 5 through 10. Fireball fungus is just one single fungus inanimate mushroom that can grow anywhere where other fungus is. It sheds bright light in a 15-foot radius and dim light for an additional 15 feet. But notably, if it's dropped to 0 hit points, it explodes as if it was the point of origin for a fireball spell with a DC 15 dexterity saving throw. So that's pretty powerful. It kind of reminds me of the torch stalk in Baldur's Gate 3, although the fireball fungus doesn't explode just from proximity, although you could absolutely homebrew that if you wanted to. Although the Dungeon Master's Guide does make some suggestions about how to increase the deadliness of it, specifically that the fireball from one of them exploding, if there are multiple fireball fungus in the area, if the fireball hits the other fungus, then of course it would also reduce it to 0 and cause a sort of chain reaction. So it suggests here that you can scale it, one level higher to be deadly for levels 11 through 16 by adding an additional fungus, then an additional fungus beyond that for level 17 to 20, because if you are caught in multiple fireballs, you would take damage from each fireball. I don't think you necessarily need to be so conservative with it. I think there are ways that you could put multiple fireball fungi in an area without necessarily making it deadly for players within that 5 to 10 level range. Or even if you just put them in separate rooms throughout your dungeon, I think that's another good way to approach it, where maybe the first one they come across when they don't know what it is, that one is the deadly one for sure, because they could accidentally trigger it and take a bunch of damage. But then once they know what it looks like and how it works, then when they maybe go into the next room where there's a combat that breaks out, and then they see that there's another fireball fungus maybe in the corner or somewhere in that room, they can maybe try to maneuver the battle in such a way that they can trigger it when there's enemies around it and then do extra damage that way, where it goes from more of a hazard for them to a hazard for the enemies. Moving on, we have green slime. So this is considered just a nuisance for characters who would be level 1 to 4. Interestingly, the first thing that stood out to me is that it has blind sight, but it isn't considered specifically a creature. It can't really be damaged or anything in any way. So I even looked through the monster manual, did a quick search. I didn't dive too deep into it if there's like a specific creature that green slime is supposed to come from. Didn't find anything, but it hangs out on walls and ceilings or even floors if you step on it. But if it's on a wall or a ceiling, and if it detects a creature that is below it, it'll just drop onto it. That creature, if they're aware of it, they can make a DC 10 dexterity saving throw and avoid being struck by it. But if not, they take 1d10 acid damage, and they will take that damage again at the start of their turns unless they take the time to scrape it off of them. It does say that it also does extra damage to wood or metal objects, dealing 2d10 acid damage to that object. And also, if you use a wood or metal object to scrape the acid off of you, whatever that object is would then be destroyed, assuming that it's non-magical. And then it can be destroyed by sunlight or cold or fire or even radiant damage. And though it does say that it destroys non-magical wood or metal, it doesn't necessarily specify whether or not it would eat through armor. I mean, presumably it would. I don't think there's anything here that restricts that. It doesn't say deals damage to things that aren't being worn or carried. So you could possibly destroy someone's weapon or armor this way. Or if they use a non-magical weapon to scrape the slime off them, that would certainly destroy their weapon. But I also think that you could use this in certain situations as maybe the solution for a puzzle, where if they need to get past just a solid metal barrier, and that's basically the puzzle of that room, but they don't otherwise have a means to do that, there could be a slime that's somewhere in the room that they would need to discover and then somehow capture it without destroying themselves or hurting themselves, and then get that onto the object to dissolve it and get to whatever that they're trying to get to. So again, I just think that's one interesting way that you could use a hazard to also be a benefit to the players. Moving on to the Inferno, this is another one that I believe is new. Again, it's not a particularly novel concept, but they put it in there and then put mechanics around it. We can see that this would be a nuisance for characters levels 11 to 16, or considered deadly for characters who are maybe levels 5 to 10. So this is a minimum of 4 contiguous 10-foot cubes of fire. Each of these cubes of fire would take 10 gallons of water to douse, which I believe is the exact amount of water the first level spell Create Water would create. It also mentions that a strong wind that is blowing for at least 1 minute will cause it to grow an additional 1d4 10-foot cubes of fire, so the fire will spread that way if there's wind blowing. The fire will burn out after 1d10 minutes without any fuel in that space to allow it to keep burning. Any object or creature that either starts their turn or enters its space takes 4d10 fire damage immediately and then is burning. And then burning again is that condition, sort of pseudo condition, where if you start your turn on fire, then you just take an extra, I think it's like 1d4 fire damage until you put yourself out. So this is a pretty interesting one. I kind of wish there were more mechanics to spread the fire if you wanted it to be more dangerous. Of course, we could come up with things on our own, but it's a pretty cool one in its own right. And then moving on, we have Poisonous Gas, which again, I think is technically new in 2024. There are other books and stuff that mention Poisonous Gas, but I don't believe any of them specifically have these mechanics. Poisonous Gas is a very generic thing. It can take a lot of forms. This is considered a nuisance for characters level 1 to 4. It's basically just a gas leak, whether it be magical or natural. So it can fill up to as many as 10 10-foot cubes. It specifically says that it has a foul odor. How strong that odor is to your players might be up to you as the DM if you wanted to require a certain perception check to sort of detect that there's a particular smell in the air. It does mention that it's continuously replenished by a natural or magical source, and then a strong wind, such as like maybe by the gust of wind spell or something, can disperse it from a certain area for 1 minute. As for the effects of the gas, when you enter the space for the first time or start your turn there, you need to make a DC 12 Constitution saving throw or take 1d10 poison damage, or half as much on a save. As long as you're in the gas, you would have disadvantage on death saving throws, which is an interesting effect. And again, I think this one could even be considered deadly for even lower level. Like if you're levels 1 to 2 and you get it, because you're stuck in this room, like if you're locked in the room that has the gas leak, you have to make this saving throw every turn. And 1d10, I mean, that could kill a level 1 character if it's like a sorcerer or a wizard, if they roll high enough. And then you can see at the bottom of the image there, they do have some ways to make it a nuisance for higher level parties, basically just by increasing the save DC and increasing the damage. Nothing too special going on there. So moving on to the quicksand pit. This is not a new one. It was buried just somewhere in the old Dungeon Master's Guide. Supposedly a nuisance for characters level 1 to 4. It basically is a 10-foot cube that's in the ground. Entering it causes you to immediately sink. No saving throw. 1d4 plus 1 feet, and you are considered restrained. At the beginning of each of your turns, you just sink an additional 1d4 feet into it. And if you are not completely submerged, you can use your action to make a DC 10 plus the number of feet that you are sunk into the quicksand strength athletics check, and you get out of it on a success. Once you are fully submerged in the quicksand, you can no longer make attempts to get out of it. You have total cover. You are considered blinded, and then you risk suffocation as well. Another creature can attempt to pull you out of it by making a strength athletics check DC 5 plus the number of feet that you are sunk into it. That's assuming that they can even reach you. It does suggest here at the bottom that you can increase the hazard level of it by increasing the pit depth as well as the rate at which you sink. I don't know that certain points that it would even be considered a nuisance, because if you're so deep in there that a player can't reach into you and grab you without also fully submerging themselves, and they would need to come up with a more creative solution, because again, you have total cover, so they can't cast certain spells on you. They would have to somehow, there would have to be some other way to get you out of that. So I think it quickly becomes deadly, maybe past 20 feet, even past 15 feet. 15 feet is pretty deep if you don't have a very reliable way to get yourself out. Moving on to Razorvine. This is considered a nuisance for characters level 1 to 4. It basically is just a plant that entangles itself in other foliage. It can cling to buildings or other surfaces, sort of like ivy. Notably, this one has immunity to bludgeoning and piercing damage. A lot of these plant-based hazards also have this feature. You specifically need to come in contact with Razorvine in order to take damage, and then you can make a dexterity DC 10 saving throw, or you take 1d10 slashing damage from the blades like thorns. I do think it's interesting that it is not immune to slashing damage, and it itself does slashing damage. So like if you're able to make it rub against itself, it could destroy itself in some way. Moving on to the River Styx. I think it's interesting that they put this one in here as sort of a general hazard, and we'll look at some similar interesting inclusions once we get to the environmental effects, because this is the first instance of them moving effects that was in a later chapter just about the different planes within Dungeons & Dragons, and then moving it directly to the hazards. The cynic in me feels like they kind of did that just to kind of pad out this chapter, and then it just kind of creates unnecessary cross-referencing when you're kind of going back and forth between the chapters about planes and the chapters about hazards and things like that. Regardless, it is the River Styx. It kind of does what it does. If you touch the waters or drink the waters, it effectively gives you the effects of befuddlement, which is the new name for the spell Feeble Mind. Although the befuddlement spell, although it's replacing Feeble Mind, technically works a little bit differently. Specifically it says here that you can't cast spells or take the magic action, which is a slight change in the wording for Feeble Mind, but it's effectively the same thing. And then you can recover from that condition the same way that you could the befuddlement spell. So if you are somehow putting the River Styx in your game and you're wondering how you might express that mechanically, this is how you would go about it. Moving on to the rock slide. This is considered deadly for levels 1 through 4. Again, this is another one that is possibly new, but again, it's hard to tell because some things were in tables, some things were, had actual sections in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Again, maybe this is something that would have been on a DM screen somewhere and they put it in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But creatures caught in a rock slide must succeed on a DC 15 dexterity saving throw, or they take 2d10 bludgeoning, fall prone, and then start moving with the rock slide. They make the saving throw, they just take half damage. When the rock slide stops, it becomes difficult terrain, and any creatures that were caught in it are then considered buried, which means they have total cover and they're also restrained. A creature can attempt to crawl out of it using a DC 15 athletics check. If they succeed on that check, then they end up on top of the rock pile, but they're still prone. On a failure, they gain 1 level of exhaustion. And then a creature who is not buried in the rubble and is not incapacitated or restrained can dig out another creature, but they basically just take a minute to do so. So I think this one is kind of interesting because this is definitely a situation where the exhaustion rules can create a death spiral because you're taking those flat penalties to your rolls, especially for characters who have low strength to begin with. A DC 15 is pretty high. It would only take, 2 failures to make it almost impossible to succeed. And then once you get that 3rd level of exhaustion, you are never going to succeed on that check if you have no bonuses to your athletics. And then an ally can certainly dig you out, but it takes them 1 minute to do so. And then again, you have total cover, so you can't see out of it. So if you're a caster, you can't misty step out of it. So I think, if you are a non-athletic character and you get caught in a rock slide, your best bet is to just stay there and not try to get out, because you don't take levels of exhaustion if you don't try to unbury yourself. You're just kind of stuck there. You can kind of scream in for help and hopefully your allies will hear you. Then just wait for them to dig you out. Don't risk the levels of exhaustion because it's quickly going to get out of your favor. And then at the bottom, you can see that it says you can increase the sort of severity of that hazard by increasing the damage that it does initially. Moving on to Vicious Vine. This is another supposedly new addition, a nuisance for levels 1 to 4. Again, these are magically animated vines that are indistinguishable from just regular vines if they are not moving. They attempt to grapple creatures who come within 5 feet of it with a DC 12 dex save. That is also the same DC to get out of the grapple. Grappled creatures take 1d10 necrotic damage at the start of their turn. Only 1 creature can be grappled at a time. One interesting thing is that a creature can use Speak with Plants and then attempt to make a persuasion check to release anyone who is currently a victim of the plants, and if they succeed on that persuasion check, then that creature will not be affected by the vicious vines for the next 24 hours. Then of course the table at the bottom says you can increase the hazard level by mainly increasing the damage and the save DC. Moving on to more of a classic hazard we have the webs. The real threat here isn't really the webs themselves, but rather the enemies that you might encounter on them, whether they be other giant spiders or just other creatures that can move on the webs, maybe without being restrained or have better movement options in general. So even though this is considered just a nuisance for levels 1 to 4, I think you could easily scale this up in whatever way just by introducing tougher enemies, higher escape DC, things like that. Moving on to the last of the hazards here, we have yellow mold. This one is sort of the reverse of brown mold in that it's destroyed by fire and sunlight rather than destroyed by cold. So this one might be easier to deal with, but it is potentially deadly, especially for lower level characters. Notably, this one just releases spores when it's touched, affecting a 10-foot cube and causing creatures in the area to make a DC 15 Constitution saving throw, or they take 2d10 poison damage and then they are poisoned for 1 minute. And then at the start of each of that creature's turn, as long as they're poisoned, they'll take an additional 1d10 poison damage, and then you get to repeat the save at the end of each of your turns. So again, if you are a lower level player, that can easily kill a level 1 to 2 characters. So definitely something to be concerned about if you are encountering yellow mold at these lower levels. But moving on from all the hazards, we're going to cover all the different environmental effects, and these ones are pretty quick to go over, but I just wanted to touch on them. Notably, none of the environmental effects are new, but again, many of them are strewn about different sections of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and they've been all consolidated into one place. The Dead Magic Zone is an example of that was buried in a table. Basically, this is an up to 300 feet diameter area that is basically under the effects of a permanent anti-magic field spell. Then sort of on the opposite end of that, you have a Wild Magic Zone, which is, exactly what it sounds like. It's a 300-foot diameter area where magic behaves more unpredictably. Anytime a creature casts a spell that uses a spell slot, they roll a d20, and then on a 20 on that roll, you roll on the Wild Magic Surge table. And I think for this one specifically, if you're going to use a Wild Magic Zone, you definitely either want to make sure that you're either spending a long time in it because you have to roll a natural 20 to even have that effect take place, or if you're not going to be spending as much time in it, you still want that Wild Magic Zone feel to matter, then maybe you do something where the first time someone casts a spell with a spell slot, you roll. If it's not a 20, then the next time they either have to roll a 19 or 20, and then the next time if that fails, it's an 18 to 20, and then once they trigger the Wild Magic Surge, then it resets back to 20, something like that. That way it's not happening all the time, but it has an increased chance to happen. As sort of each time you cast a spell, it's putting more energy into the air until it inevitably triggers a surge. Moving on to the effects of extreme cold and extreme heat. They both work basically the exact same way that they did in 2014. One small change to the extreme cold is that it doesn't say that it can be counteracted by cold weather gear, such as like coats and gloves, but we did see that in the adventuring gear in the player's handbook, that things like the tent and the sleeping bag both basically completely counteract the effects of extreme cold. I presume that would also still be the same way for actual cold weather gear. I know the Rime of the Frost Maiden adventure setting also imposes the extreme cold conditions, although again, it's very easy to counteract just by wearing cold weather gear. And then you can see for the extreme heat, if you don't have access to drinking water, each hour that you spend there, you need to make an increasing Constitution saving throw or gain exhaustion. Again, this is technically a situation where the exhaustion levels could cause another death spiral. But I think these are so low, it is, potentially so easy to overcome these mechanics. And that's kind of one of the problems that I have with these particular ones, is that they're so binary. And it feels like it'd be easy to just overcome them in some way. Like, extreme cold, like either using the tent and the sleeping bag, cold weather gear. And then if you're 5th level or higher, you potentially have access to something like Lehman's Tiny Hut, which specifically says that the area within it is, a normal temperature. So that would protect you during a long rest. The extreme heat is maybe a slight exception because you do need access to drinkable water, which is something that might be easier for us as a DM to restrict on our players if we wanted to. But again, a level 1 spell like Create Water would be able to counteract that pretty easily if you have I think it's a cleric or druid has access to that spell. Of course, that is sort of a spell slot tax each day that you're in that extreme heat to counteract it, but that's a pretty small price to pay to not take these increasing levels of exhaustion. Moving on to frigid water and deep water. Much like extreme cold, the effects of frigid water can be overcome by cold resistance. I think I've only ever encountered the effects of frigid water once, not personally, but I've seen it in games that I've been in, and that didn't last very long. I do think that the deep water could actually pose a moderate threat because the only way to get around it is by having a swim speed, and there aren't actually a lot of things that give you a swim speed, or not easily anyway. There are certain species that have a swim speed by default. I think there are certain subclasses that are aquatic themed that get a swim speed as well, even if it's temporary. But as far as spells go, there isn't an efficient spell to give your entire party a swim speed. There is Alter Self, which it can do it for one character. And then there's Freedom of Movement, which in 2024 also says that it gives you a swim speed equal to your speed. And it also has the ability to upcast to target additional creatures in 2024. But again, that's a 4th level spell. So if you're wanting to affect many members of your party with that effect, that's going to be a pretty significant investment from that character that's casting that spell. However, I do imagine that this would mainly come up in more of a seafaring adventure. And I imagine if players know that they're going into a sort of a water-based adventure, they're probably either going to play a species that has a swim speed, or they're going to play a subclass that gets a swim speed, or they're going to choose spells that give them a swim speed. So unless you're bringing this up maybe just in a certain arc of an existing adventure that isn't otherwise underwater, this might not ever really be that much of a threat. Moving on to some other miscellaneous effects, such as heavy precipitation, such as, heavy rainfall or snowfall. This is, again, unchanged, but I do think it's funny that they both mentioned that the area is lightly obscured and creatures have disadvantage on all wisdom perception checks, because that is redundant, because lightly obscured technically already gives them disadvantage on perception checks. Technically, if we were kind of splitting hairs, if a creature had the ability to see through light obscurement somehow, they would still have disadvantage on wisdom perception checks, because that is a separate rider within the rules of precipitation. It's not tied to the light obscurement. I think high altitude is actually an interesting effect because there isn't really a way around it. You just have to deal with it. But maybe sort of because of that, the penalties for it aren't that severe. It just kind of reduces the rate at which you can travel. Strong winds would just impose disadvantage on attack rolls with weapons. I kind of wish there was more of a benefit or penalty to it, depending on whether or not you are facing into the wind or you had the wind behind you. But I think one notable thing about this one here is that it says a flying creature in a strong wind must land at the end of its turn or fall, which of course would make sense for a regular flying creature, but notably this also does affect creatures with hover. Hover specifically only covers if the creature is knocked prone or the speed is reduced to 0. It does not protect them from strong winds. So if you have a creature who is maybe difficult to knock out of the air, if you have a spell that can create strong winds, you can create that strong wind around them. And if they end their turn in the air, then they would be forced to fall out of the air. Moving on to slippery ice as well as thin ice. Unsurprisingly, slippery ice is considered difficult terrain. Notably, you don't have to move on the ice to risk falling prone. If you just start your turn there, you also have to make the saving throw or risk falling prone. And then thin ice is kind of interesting because it kind of creates a little more work for the DM because it imposes a certain weight tolerance for every 10-foot square. If we don't want to do all the work as a DM, we can easily just roll those dice once and say all the ice across this whole pond or whatever it is has the same weight tolerance. However, if you really wanted to dig into it, you could assign a different weight tolerance to each 10-foot square if you have that time in your preparation. This of course obviously hopes that the players are keeping track of how much their character weighs, how much their equipment weighs. So if you are going into a stretch of the adventure where your players are going to be going across like a lake of frozen water, you might ask them to make sure that they know how much their characters weigh before that next session starts. But I also think this is a good example of combining two different environmental effects or even two different hazards to create more complex and more challenging encounters, such as in this example, you not only have the thin ice of falling through the ice and falling into the water, but then once you're in the water, you're in frigid water and you're subject to the effects of that as well. So we can easily apply this to other effects and hazards, such as, for example, imagine that you're in an encounter with slippery ice, but then your players are like, okay, well, if I don't want to risk falling prone in the ice, I can just cast a fly spell on myself, and then I'm not on the ice, so I don't need to risk falling. But if you have both slippery ice and strong winds, then they have to kind of pick which one that they want to do. Maybe that's a little too mean because then no matter what, they risk falling prone. But you could also do strong winds in an inferno because, again, the winds, when they blow for a minute, spread the fire even further. Or if you want to be really mean, you can combine an inferno with brown fungus and just create this big patch of brown fungus that just continuously spreads. So there's a lot of different cool ways that you could combine a lot of these things to create almost an encounter on itself. Like if players are trapped in an inferno where there's brown fungus, how do you get out of that before you're either consumed by the fire or killed by the brown fungus as it's spreading around and kind of inching closer to you? And then the last bit we're going to cover here is some different planar effects. I'm not going to take the time to read through all of these. And this is another point similar to the River Styx where I'm a bit torn on their inclusion in this particular chapter about the hazards and environmental effects. I think you just could have included that there are planar effects and then reference to the chapter about the planes to have, potential DMs go there to read about what the different effects are on the different planes while they're also reading about that plane. Because they do only include a handful of them in this chapter. They don't include all of the different planar effects in this chapter. The rest of them are located in the chapter about the plane. So to me, it just would have made more sense to me to put them all in that chapter and just put a reference to planar effects in this chapter. These are all basically the same as they were in 2014. I think there's a slight change to the Arcadia one where you are immune to the frightened and poisoned conditions. In 2014, you were also immune to disease and poison, which made you were immune to poison damage. Notably, that is removed in 2024. Notably, also in 2014, these were considered optional regional effects, but they are no longer necessarily considered optional, or at least they don't have that optional feature text in front of them. However, generally speaking, I do like the idea of these sort of regional buffs or even debuffs like this. It doesn't even need to be on a whole planar level. You can kind of have these little regional effects. And again, I'm in Rime of the Frostmaiden right now. So for example, in the last zone of Rime of the Frostmaiden, there is an environmental effect there. And it not only serves to make this place feel like a persistent threat, but it also serves as a sort of a clock, so the characters just can't take their time there and kind of dilly-dally. They need to keep moving along. Otherwise, this thing might irreversibly change them in a certain way. I don't want to say specifically what it does. But in general, I think these sort of regional effects are very underutilized in the game. I know some legendary monsters have effects on the zone around them, but they don't really have any mechanical penalty or benefit. So I think this is a situation where if you want to add a little bit more spice to certain areas in your game that are more important, you can have these sort of auras or regional effects just to give the players, something a little bit different that's interacting with them, and it just kind of adds that bit more to the experience of being in that area. So that's all there is to the hazards environmental effects in the new Dungeon Master's Guide for 2024. What do you think about the new or new-ish additions to the hazards? I know the Fireball Fungus was the one that they were really excited about. It is pretty cool. Again, I do like the Torch Stalk in Baldur's Gate 3. If you are a DM, how have you used different hazards in your game, whether they were, again, environmental effects or specific hazards? Have you come up with specific ones on your own, and what did those look like? I'd be interested to know that as well. Or if you're a player in the games, what kind of hazards have you run into? Are there any specific ones that were your favorite? Are there maybe some ones that you ran into that you weren't a fan of? I'd like to know that all down in the comments below. And while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you liked what you saw here, please consider hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already. I come out with new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. I appreciate all your guys' time, and I'll see you in the next one.